So I want to move into a discussion now of Kant's Critique of Judgment, and this is the edition of it that I have here, which came out in 1790. The Critique of Pure Reason had come out, as we said, in 1781, and its second edition was, I believe, 1787, and that was followed in 1788 by the Critique of Practical Reason, which had to do with morality. And then this book here, the Critique of Judgment, which came out in 1790, has to do with aesthetics. It's a classic treatise on aesthetics, and it's very influential for its influence on, or very notable for its influence on Schopenhauer, who in turn will have a big influence on Nietzsche. So there's a direct line that extends from, before this actually, from Lessing's Laocoon. The Laocoon was written in the 1760s, I believe, and to this book, I don't know whether Kant bothered with Lessing or not, but it's a consistency of thought, nonetheless, regarding the beautiful and the sublime, down through Schopenhauerian aesthetics and the world as will and representation to Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. The Apollonian and the Dionysian in the Birth of Tragedy are the beautiful and the sublime, transformed into mythological god figures. But that's where it comes from. Behind Nietzsche's discussion in the Birth of Tragedy, which is published, I think, 1872, is this discussion of the dynamics of the beautiful and the sublime, which Kant is very good with here in this book, I think. So moving right into it then, it's a much shorter critique than the two subsequent critiques are much shorter. I think the shortest of all was the Critique of Practical Reason. It's been a long time since I've read that one. I don't want to go back through that one right now since it bores me a little bit. But this one is very interesting, and it's about a third of the length, roughly, of the Critique of Pure Reason, so it's much shorter. He begins by talking about how the faculty of judgment now is a third faculty, and he did not mention this in the Critique of Pure Reason. For Pure Reason, we had simply the understanding, we had the reason, and we saw that the understanding was concerned with the concepts, the a priori concepts, such as causality and substance and reciprocity and quantity and quality, the concepts that have to do with the relationship to nature. They make scientific experience of nature possible, and any scientific objective knowledge presupposes them to organize discursive thought about objects. So the concepts of the understanding have a relationship to the intuitions that come to us in sensory experience, on the one hand. The ideas of the reason, on the other, we saw were the big metaphysical ideas. For Kant, there's really only three: God, freedom, and immortality. Those are the three big ideas of the reason that the reason uses, not in reference to the outer world, but in reference to the manifold of the concepts of the understanding. The reason is the faculty of inference, which organizes the manifold of the concepts of the understanding, borrows the concepts from them, and is very often guilty of a transcendental abuse, what Kant called the transcendental dialectic of misapplying these ideas to something that is outside the bounds of a possible experience. And so metaphysics is something that we can use in a regulative sense. Kant doesn't want us, as we saw, to get rid of ideas about God and the soul and freedom. They're absolutely essential, actually, to his philosophy. They have a regulative function to play, especially insofar as they regulate human behavior, and also the way that the understanding proceeds, but they also regulate the way people behave in society. It's necessary to have these ideas for those purposes. So we have ideas of the reason corresponding to concepts of the understanding, two different faculties in the psyche, which are often at odds with each other in speculative metaphysics, or what Kant calls speculative reason. But now we have this third faculty that he introduces here, which he's calling judgment. And judgment, he says, is now the faculty in between these two, which mediates between them. And judgment has to do with the apprehension of the object in its subjective effect on my faculty of pleasure or displeasure. So it's much closer to what Jung would call simply feeling. It's much closer to the faculty of feeling. And it is very much more subjective than either the understanding or the reason. And so it has to do with the estimation of what my apprehension of the object that I see, whether it's a natural object or an artistic object, how it affects me in terms of my pleasure or pain, in terms of how I respond to that object. So it's very subjective, although there is an objective dimension to it. And so there are two types of judgment. There is going to be what he calls the aesthetical judgment, which has to do with art, basically, the beautiful and the sublime, and the teleological judgment, which has to do with the purposiveness of nature. And so in the one case, teleology has to do with the final causes of things, the purpose of nature. And he's going to say that there is an a priori axiom of the faculty of judgment, which has to do precisely with this assumption, this a priori assumption that there is purpose in nature. And it's also going to be a guiding thread in his discussion of the arts. So we have both the apprehension of purpose in nature and the apprehension of a beautiful art object as both belonging to the same faculty, the faculty of judgment, whose guiding a priori axiom is, as we have seen, purpose, that there is purpose involved. Now, with regard to the aesthetical judgment, there are two aspects to the aesthetical judgment, the beautiful on the one hand and the sublime on the other. So the book will be broken up into two halves. In this case, we have the first half will be the aesthetic judgment, which will analyze the beautiful and the sublime, and the teleological judgment, which will analyze the whole concept of seeing purpose in nature. And it will have some relationship then also to that third argument for the existence of God, the physico-theological argument. He'll bring that back in again and discuss that more in the second half of this book. But in the first half, the first half in turn is then broken up into two halves, the analytic of the beautiful and the analytic of the sublime. And then with regard to the sublime, the beautiful has to do simply with that which, when seen, pleases, to quote Joyce. It's very simple. But the sublime is a little more complex. It's a different sort of aesthetic emotion, and there are two aspects to it. There's the mathematical sublime, what Kant calls the mathematical sublime, and the dynamical sublime. The mathematical sublime is the perception of vast reserves of space, like in landscape painting, for example, when you have the sublime expanse of space. And then on the other hand, the dynamical sublime has to do with power, with the sublime in the sense in which the Hindus mean it, and which they take as their main aesthetic, actually. Their main aesthetic criterion is personified by the dancing Shiva, the god who dances on the ruins of civilization, the impersonal powers that can blow human civilization apart. So there are those two aspects to the sublime, and Kant's going to talk about those. But first, in the first part of the book, then, he talks about the analytic of the beautiful. So that's the first part. And what he does then is he takes the analytic of the beautiful, he takes the beautiful, and he plugs it back into his fourfold architectonic. So he drags out the dusty architectonic of quantity, quality, relation, and modality, and he plugs the beautiful into these four. But first he starts not with quantity but with quality, because he says that with regard to quality, the beautiful has immediately to do with quality, with sensation, with the real in the outer world of appearances that affects me in a subjective manner, and then moves into quantity after that. So with regard then to the beautiful, insofar as he plugs it into the category of quality, then he makes a distinction between three different kinds of satisfaction, or three different aspects of this subjective faculty of taste, basically, where he says that there's a difference between the merely pleasant, when I say that something is merely pleasant, versus when I say that it's good, or when I say that it's beautiful. So we have three different things here that have to be distinguished: the pleasant, the good, and the beautiful. He says, if I'm looking at a meadow and I see the green color in the meadow, that green color is itself mere sensation, and it's an objective property that's in the meadow. But if I say the green of that meadow is pleasing to me, now it's subjective, because I'm registering the effect of that color on me now. So I'm saying that it's subjective now, and it's pleasant. So that's what the pleasant is. The pleasant is merely subjective, and it's very subjective insofar as each person has likes different things in life. One person will like stringed instruments, another person will find woodwind instruments more pleasant. Another person will find red wine more pleasant than this person, who will find white wine more pleasant. Those are subjective, and the pleasant is merely subjective. It doesn't involve the use of concepts at all, like the good does, however. Now, when we say that something is good, there are two aspects to the good. We can say either that it's good for some use, it's good for something, or we can say that it's good in and of itself. So there are two aspects to the good, but both, with respect to the good actually passes, judgment actually passes into the realm of concepts now with the good, because in order to understand whether something is good for something, the sensation of its, or the perception of it, has to be filtered through concepts, which then give it an estimation. I have to know what it's for in order for my faculty of judgment to estimate whether it's good for something, whether it's something I can use, or whether it's just good in and of itself. So the good differs from the pleasant in that respect, in that it makes use of concepts, whereas the pleasant does not. It's purely sensory. Now, the beautiful also, Kant is going to say, is purely sensory and does not make use of concepts either, like the pleasant. However, it differs from the pleasant insofar as it can attain to a level of objectivity. When I say that something is beautiful, such as when I say that this landscape is beautiful, or let's say that I say this statue by Myron is beautiful, I'm actually speaking with a universal voice, according to Kant. It's a universal judgment that I'm making, that's saying not just that I find it beautiful, but that I have refined my faculty of taste to the point where I can recognize what is beautiful and what isn't, objectively speaking. And so, also the other thing about the beautiful is that my apprehension of it results in a disinterested pleasure, which is different from the merely pleasant. What is pleasant is not disinterested. And the same thing with the good. The beautiful, though, for Kant is disinterested pleasure, and it's disinterested in the same sense in which Schopenhauer means it later when he says that if I say that something is beautiful, I don't want to reproduce with it. So this is different from my saying that a woman is beautiful. If I say that a woman is beautiful, that's not disinterested pleasure there. There's a biological interest in continuing the species that's bound up with my apprehension of her beauty. So that's not disinterested pleasure. Or if I say this food looks good, that's also not disinterested because I'm going to eat it and it has a biological, it's concerned with my own subjectivity. So the merely pleasant is linked with our animal comforts. And the beautiful is something that appeals only to men. It has nothing to do with the animal aspect of the human being, in which something is always in relationship to my desires or my power drive or the struggle for survival or whatever it may be. Those are all interested. But when I say that something is beautiful, like a statue by Myron, it doesn't benefit me anyway. I'm not going to use it for anything. It's beautiful, simply in and of and for itself. It's a beautiful object. So the key thing for Kant here is beauty as disinterested pleasure. And this, of course, will influence Schopenhauer's idea of aesthetics when he talks about in the world as will and representation, how the beautiful consists in suspending the will. The will is what drives us toward fear and desire. He crosses Kant with Buddhism. Fear and desire, which are the motivations of Buddhism, which are quelled through the attainment of nirvana. Schopenhauer will use that as his basic aesthetic model in saying that, in adapting Kant's disinterested pleasure by saying that in a work of art, all my animal interests are suspended. The will is temporarily suspended in me when I am participating in a great work of art. And so he extends that disinterested pleasure into that domain. And so then in the second category, the second moment of Kant's Analytic of the beautiful, he plugs it into quantity. And he says that the beautiful, insofar as it relates to quantity, is this idea of universality. When I say that something is beautiful, I mean to say that it is beautiful for all men everywhere and all time. And of course, this is the age of the world picture in which the aesthetics are classical. They're basically Greek aesthetics, in which everyone who thinks that something is beautiful, everyone's on the same page here regarding aesthetic standards for beauty, namely that which the Greeks found beautiful, that which is pleasing to the eye and harmonious of form and proportion, that kind of beautiful which is thought to be objective. But of course, this is merely a culturally understood form or criterion of beauty, and it doesn't. The Hindus wouldn't have agreed with this at all. The Hindu aesthetic was totally different, and indeed, Goethe, who himself saw works of Hindu art, thought that they were ugly because he didn't understand them. It would take another century of scholarship yet to find Hindu art beautiful, because Hindu art does not work the same way that Greek art does. It's not meant to be beautiful to the eye. It's meant to be a form of contemplation for the mind to perform a certain function that more often than not has to do with the sublime than it does have to do with the beautiful. But Kant says that the universal aspect, this is the quantitative aspect of beauty, is when I say that something is beautiful, I have ascended from my personal prejudices to say that it is beautiful for all, and that all men would find this as beautiful, not just me.